For my last two Zentangle tutorial videos, I talked about how to design your very own doodles. Today I'm going to carry along with that same theme with grids.
Welcome back to Mr. News Art Class. It's wonderful to see your smiling faces today.
So here I've drawn three different types of grids, and I want to take a moment to just talk about each type. The first one is just a plain, normal, average, everyday grid, just simple rows and columns. And it was made just by having straight lines that go horizontally and vertically. I tried to get the squares about the same size. Some of them are a little bit larger, some of them are a little bit smaller, but I tried to get them about the same size. I didn't bother. The temptation is to come get a ruler and measure everything and use it to make perfectly straight lines. And you can do that, but it's a time suck. It eats all of your time. It's a lot simpler and smoother and funner to just go with it. And you also get more interesting results. Having the discrepancies in size and shape, it's not a bad thing. It's actually kind of what helps make your artwork more interesting. The second grid is a distorted grid, which kind of creates an illusion of a three-dimensional space. It feels like this is a regular grid that has been warped in space and maybe stretched and pulled and bent. And it's caused by just having curved lines. So I still had verticals and horizontals, but instead of being straight, they're all curved. The verticals all getting farther away from each other as they go out from this point. It kind of makes it feel like you had a grid like this, but then you pinched it right here in the middle, or you stretched it and pulled it out on these ends, or you curved it and bent it around a shape of some kind. And then the third grid, I just made a grid of dots, and I just, again, tried to space them out equally like I did with these lines. I noticed about halfway through that my rows were kind of becoming a diagonal row instead of a horizontal row. But again, I'm not concerned with that. I'm just really trying to get it close enough to correct. And it's not even really correct, that's the wrong word. Just close enough to horizontals and verticals. And I could have even purposefully done diagonal rows of dots, or there's really no wrong way to make a grid. So these are really just three different ways of making grids. They are not the only ways of making grids. There are hundreds of millions of infinite different ways of creating grids. But today I want to show you how you can use these three different types of grids to make your very own Zentangle doodles. If you watched either of my last two videos about doodling your own patterns, you remember that the common theme we had is, even though we were using different tools, each pattern starts off by choosing, do you want it to be filling or branching or a path pattern? And then we ask what shapes we're going to use, and then we talk about what value we're going to use. Now these, by the nature of being a grid, that grid fills a space, so they're all going to be the fill kind of pattern. So we can leave that out. We don't have to concern ourselves with that. What we do need to do is pick basic shapes and think about values. Now with a grid, one thing you might or might not want to do is alternate values. Think about a checkerboard or a chessboard, how it's got alternating squares of light and dark and light and dark and light and dark. And you may sometimes want to do that with your patterns in a grid. Or sometimes you may choose not to do that. Quite often you will see grids that have a pattern in one square and then the next square is empty, and then a pattern, empty, pattern, empty, pattern, empty, pattern, empty, and continuing like that. Another variation on that is having a dark pattern, then a light pattern, dark and light, and dark and light, and dark and light, and dark and light, and carrying on that way. Another thing to remember is that you can still use stems, rotations, auras, combining, resizing, juxtaposition, any of our other tools in the patterns that you put into the grid. Really, what you're doing with the grid is giving yourself a whole lot of tiny little squares to make individual patterns in, which leads me to my next point, is that some people like to make a grid and then fill every single tiny little square with its own tiny little pattern, which can get really complicated really fast. In the interest of avoiding that complexity and keeping things mostly simple, what I would like to do is come up with some kind of pattern that will have the alternating squares of different values like a checkerboard. So I'm going to grab my thick pen, my 08 pen with the thick nib, and use that to make really dark squares, and then leave the light squares completely white. And when choosing a basic shape to use, I can go back and think about juxtaposition. I have straight lines in my grid. I could use an organic curvy type of shape to fill my patterns within that grid. That would create some juxtaposition, but I may or may not want to do that. I may not want these to stand out like that from the grid. I may want them to feel more unified with the grid, in which case I would use geometric shapes. So I think what I might try here is to do something with these zigzag lines, which would still be very geometric, but they're using diagonals instead of verticals or horizontals. So it would still give a little bit of juxtaposition of the difference between those verticals and horizontals against the diagonals, but not the same amount as it would if I used curves. So I just made there a zigzag, and then a dotted line between them. Another interesting thing you could do that I forgot to mention earlier is, instead of alternating squares, sometimes you might rotate and do that same pattern this way, vertically instead of horizontally. Again, that's just another option. I'm going to be skipping squares, so I have dark and white and dark and white. And there, that finished pattern actually turned out a whole lot more interesting than I expected it to. Halfway through, I was thinking, oh, I'm going to have to come in here with my smaller pen and do something else in these alternating squares just to make it look more interesting, because that zigzag, dotted line, zigzag wasn't going to look very good. But that's one of the things you find with Zentangles, is that as you continuously repeat and repeat and repeat, and you end up filling a whole space, you find that very mundane, tiny little nothings that don't look interesting at all can, over the course of an entire pattern, create a very interesting space. This almost looks like ribbons woven across, where it's got horizontal ribbons that are that have this pattern on them, and then maybe vertical ribbons that are just white ribbons, and they're just woven together. And now I want to figure out what to do with this one. I could go with trying to figure out what shape I want to use, but one thing that actually works really well on these distorted grids is to just simply go for a checkerboard. Go all out. Make it dark black and bright white squares. And it can give the illusion that it is a three-dimensional surface, especially if you go back in and use a pencil to shade wherever there might be shadows. But I think I've already done that in a different video, so I want to come up with something different this time. And I think what I want to do is create some kind of an aura that goes inside the spaces instead of outside. So I'll pick a space to start with. And there I've just made auras inside of each other instead of auras outside of each other. I think I'll probably still go with the idea of alternating pattern blank here as well. So I've got that pattern here, skip this one and go here. Now this is important. I need to think about what that total shape would look like. So I'm going to carry these outside of the box very briefly just to show what that whole shape would look like. And so when I make auras inside of there, I don't want them here to be an aura inside of the box, the bounding box around my whole pattern. I want it to be an aura inside the box of that part of the grid. So then when I make my next one, I could imagine that you see how they've got the corners here? Because that right there would be the corner of the space here, the grid space. And there you go. That one's done. This is exactly the kind of pattern that my students always tell me, "That looks so hard, how do you do that?" And as you just saw, it was so ridiculously easy. All I did was draw some curved lines, and then draw the same shape inside of itself a couple of times. Which is my favorite thing about Zentangles. They're so simple, but they look like they're so complex. And so the viewers, the people looking at them, always end up thinking that it was way more complex and way more difficult than it actually was. And then they compliment you for your amazing artwork. And sure, it took some time, but there was nothing difficult at all about doing that. And now there are all sorts of interesting ways you can utilize a dot grid like this. You can make different types of lines that connect the dots in certain ways, or go around or between the dots in certain ways. There's so many different things you can do that it's hard to come up with one great option to show you. So what I've just done here is make a sort of chain or a sort of helical shape that wraps around those dots. And then I'll go back in there and darken up the dots, make them a nice black dot instead of a pencil dot. Now I'm going to repeat that for each one of these columns of dots, and when I'm done with that, I'll see whether or not this pattern needs anything else. And now, just looking at this, I feel like it needs something else crisscrossing horizontally, or maybe even diagonally. As a matter of fact, I think what I want to do is go for some juxtaposition. Get something straight line in the background and maybe both diagonals. And there you have that one finished. Notice how breaking the grid with these diagonal boxes here really helps to emphasize and lift up the parts that do use the grid in the foreground. And that's also aided by juxtaposition of the curvy lines against the straight lines. And it's also aided by the line weight. The fact that those curvy bits were made with the thicker 08 size pen and the background lines were made with the very tiny 005 pen really helps to emphasize that illusion of depth, of lifting up the curvy bits and pushing back the straight lines. So today we learned 3 different ways of using different types of grids to make different types of Zentangle doodles. As always, there's no wrong way to make any of these. And if you're coming up with your own patterns or using any of these patterns that I've shown you here, I'd really love to see them. You can send an email to this email address on your screen, myart@mrnew.com. That's just an email address I've set up for collecting anything you guys want to send me. And be sure to tell me in that email whether or not it's okay for me to use your art in my videos. I would love to start showcasing viewer artwork in my Zentangle tutorials each Sunday. If you like this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up button. And if you want to keep getting more videos like this, hit the subscribe button, and then click the little bell icon where you can choose whether to get an email reminder or a notification on your mobile device to let you know every time I release new videos. Next week, I'll be using these last 3 squares here to finish up my series on how to design your own Zentangle doodles. Also, if you're interested in learning some other art skills outside of the Zentangle style, I have a series that I release on Thursdays with beginner-level art advice that's useful for all kinds of artists. If there are any other art topics you'd like to learn about, leave a comment down below. I would love to help you grow. And of course, as always, remember that if you're struggling with any of this and it's not turning out the way you want it, just remember that you don't have to be the best. Just do your best.